So, let me ask you something. What industry are you really in? You might say tech or services, maybe retail. But what if, out of the blue, you got a massive bill claiming you were actually in construction? Well, for a company called Detector Inspector, this wasn't some weird hypothetical. It became a very real and very expensive legal fight. Let's get into the wild case of the accidental construction company.
It really all comes down to this one question, which seems pretty simple on the surface, right? Are the folks who come into a rental property to check the smoke alarms and gas appliances, are they actually construction workers? Well, the answer turns out to be way more complicated than you think and worth a whole lot of money.
So, on one side of the ring, you've got Detector Inspector. Their business is pretty much what the name says. And on the other side, you have LeavePlus, a group that manages a special fund for the construction industry. The whole thing kicked off when LeavePlus basically sent Detector Inspector a bill, saying, hey, your employees are part of our construction scheme and you owe us money.
Now, to really get what's going on here, we have to dive into the legal rules of the game. And believe me, this is not your typical straightforward legal setup. It gets a little weird.
Okay, so what's this fund all about? It's for something called portable long service leave. See, in an industry like construction, you might work for 5 different companies on 5 different projects over 10 years. This system lets you build up your long service leave benefits in one central piggy bank, no matter who you're working for. It's actually super important for people in project-based jobs.
And here's where things get really strange. So the government passes this act, this law, that makes employers pay a fee. It's basically a tax. But, and get this, for the most important definitions, like what the construction industry even is, the act itself is silent. It doesn't say. Instead, it just points to the rulebook of a private company, LeavePlus. Just think about that for a second. The meaning of a government law is being controlled by a private document.
Now, this wasn't some mistake or an oversight. It was totally intentional. The whole idea was for the government to take a step back and let the industry itself manage its own program. You can see it right here in this quote from the minister back in 1997. The goal was to hand over the keys to the industry. But, and this is a huge but, they put in a really critical safeguard. It's called Section 7, and it is the key to this entire case. It says that LeavePlus can't just change the rules whenever it wants to bring more and more people into the scheme. If a rule change has the effect of expanding who can get paid out of the fund, it has to get government approval first. Remember that word effect. It's going to be important.
So, looking at this really unusual legal setup, Detector Inspector spotted an opportunity. They decided, you know what? We're going to challenge the very rulebook that's being used against us.
See, these rules weren't just written once and forgotten. They were changed over the years. A new definition was added back in '98, another tweak happened in 2008, and then in 2014, there was a major rewrite. Detector Inspector basically said, hold on a minute, some of these changes, especially the ones in 2008 and 2014, were done without getting the government's okay like they were supposed to.
So their whole case really boiled down to this. Those rule changes in 2008 and 2014 illegally stretched the definition of the construction industry so far that it suddenly pulled their business in. They argued those changes were invalid, which means the very rules being used to charge them shouldn't even exist in their current form.
Let's look at one of their specific arguments, because it's pretty clever. Originally, the rules had a clause that said routine maintenance was an exception to being in the construction industry. But in the 2014 rewrite, the wording changed. Now it was an exception to construction work. Detector Inspector argued that this tiny, subtle change of just a few words actually had a massive impact, and it legally expanded who's considered in the industry.
All right, so the battle lines are drawn. The case goes to the Supreme Court of Victoria, and now it's up to the judge to sort through this whole tangled mess of private rules, public law, and decades of changes. And the judge's entire decision really hinged on one powerful idea. He zeroed in on that key safeguard, Section 7, and he focused on that word we talked about, effect. This meant the case wasn't going to be about clever wordplay or finding loopholes. It was all about the real-world impact. The only question that mattered was, did these rule changes actually bring more people into the scheme? So let's apply that thinking to Detector Inspector's first big claim, the one about moving the routine maintenance clause, and how that illegally expanded the scheme. So what was the judge's verdict? A big nope. He looked at it and said, look, even though the wording moved from one section to another, the practical result was exactly the same. The companies that had to pay before the change still had to pay after. The ones that were exempt before were still exempt. The effect was zero, so no government approval was necessary.
Okay, so what about their second big argument? The old rulebook was tied to these things called industrial awards, which are just formal documents that outline pay and conditions for certain jobs. The 2014 rewrite got rid of those specific references and used broader descriptions of the work instead. Detector Inspector said, aha, that change massively widened the net.
And again, the judge just wasn't buying it. He looked back at the old rules and found they were already pretty broad. They used the phrase work of a kind, so you didn't actually have to be covered by that specific award, you just had to be doing the same type of work. The judge basically saw the 2014 changes not as some big expansion, but more like a cleanup job, just making the rules clearer without really changing who they applied to. So, after taking apart Detector Inspector's arguments one by one, the judge turned to the final, big question. Is this company, when you get right down to it, part of the construction industry? And the answer was a very clear, very definitive yes. The judge concluded that because they do maintenance and repairs on things like smoke alarms and gas appliances and provide electrical services, Detector Inspector's business is substantially within the construction industry.
And with that ruling, Detector Inspector's whole case just collapsed. They got nothing. Their attempts to get out of the scheme and get their money back failed completely.
So what are the big lessons here? Well, first, your business isn't defined by the name on your van, it's defined by the actual work you do. Second, in the eyes of the law, the real-world effect of a rule can be way more important than the exact words on the page. And maybe the wildest lesson of all is that a super important legal definition can be hiding in a place you'd never think to look, like the rulebook of a private company that ends up having the same power as a government tax. It's a pretty powerful reminder to always read the fine print.
And that kind of leaves us with one last thing to think about. If you forget about the labels, forget about your marketing, and you just focus on the actual tasks your business does day in and day out, what industry are you really in? The answer might just surprise you.